Plato's Republic as Metaphor for Enlightenment by Anthony N. Lundy, May 2011. Table of Contents. Introduction. 3. Enlightenment. 4. Mystical Experiences. 7. Plato's Rules. 26. Book I. 28. Book 2-531. The Sunday, Line and Cave. 44. Self and Subject to Object Merging. 53. Book 8-1059. Conclusion. 62. Bibliography. 64. Many scholars regard the Republic as Plato's most comprehensive and seminal work. However, its central theme has been the subject of much debate, resulting in many varying opinions. For instance, some interpretations regard it as a response to the weakness of democracy that resulted in the Peloponnesian War, a reaction to the sophists, masters of the art of illusion, clever rhetoricians, who twisted the truth to suit their arguments, an ethical treatise on the nature of justice, or a pedagogical treatise on education encouraging open-mindedness, thinking outside the box, not accepting convention, and thinking mathematically or scientifically. However, I contend there is another interpretation that suggests an underlying unity to Plato's thought, to bring the soul nearer to the truth or to achieve enlightenment. I propose that the dialogues of Plato are stories and analogies crafted deliberately, to explain and set up the conditions for achieving enlightenment. Although the word enlightenment usually connotes something mystical in nature, it is my contention that Plato offers a more discursive or intellectual approach to an understanding of what enlightenment really is. In other words, I believe Plato is deliberately attempting to appeal to the intellect in grasping an inner spiritual experience. This seems to be his chief concern in many of the dialogues. It is the hidden law governing what the thinker says. Heidegger 9. It is not my claim, however, that every dialogue reflects this, but is true, if the dialogues are taken as a whole. What I mean by enlightenment, generally speaking, is a journey of the soul selves from bondage to direct knowledge and understanding of the true nature of self. I refer to self in the sense of the soul being experienced as the self. In other words, in terms of Plato's tripartite theory of soul, the self is the same, as soul, the rational part, that controls and corrects the balance between the appetite and the spirit. To experience the true nature of self, however, involves an integration of the tripartite soul, the many becoming the one with the rational governing the other components. This process involves, as I will attempt to show, the soul self journey through the stages of cognition represented by Plato's divided line analogy or allegory of the cave from the world of images through the intelligible world and ultimately to the level of forms, or the good. Enlightenment occurs once the soul has reached the good. Cognitively speaking, however, this entails a unifying experience characterized by a blurring of subject-to-object relationships. My focus in this paper, therefore, is to try to unveil this unity by addressing the following: 1. An explanation of what mystics say about it, 2. A demonstration of parallels between mystics and Platonic ideas in the discussion of Book 2-4 with emphasis on justice and the many becoming one, 3. A discussion of the cave and divided line, as they relate to achieving enlightenment, 4. A discussion of Book 8-10 with emphasis on Plato's return to the earlier theme of justice, and 5. Conclusion. I have already laid out, in the above context of Plato's Republic, that enlightenment is the journey of the soul from bondage to a deeper understanding of the nature of self. It entails the integration of the tripartite soul. However, to make the argument that Plato's central concern is enlightenment, we must define it more precisely and, in doing so, dispel misconceptions about its meaning. In Sanskrit, the word for enlightenment is bhati, which means awakened. According to the Oxford English Dictionary Online, the following definitions are listed: 1. The action of bringing someone to a state of greater knowledge, understanding, or insight, the state of being enlightened in this way. 2. The state of spiritual insight or awareness, which frees a person from the cycle of suffering and rebirth. It is evident by looking at some of these definitions, that they vary in meaning. It is common knowledge, for instance, that the word was used to refer to the 18th century movement called the Enlightenment, that promulgated self-autonomy. However, of course, this is not the meaning to which I am referring here. There is also the meaning derived mainly from religious sources, such as Buddhism or Hinduism, and involves an awakening of some kind, which is closer to my meaning. For the sake of clarity, perhaps it is useful, at this point, to define precisely what I mean by enlightenment. I can think of no better definition of enlightenment than the one put forward by the renowned British scholar Evelyn Underhill. Although she uses the term mysticism, I will be using the word enlightenment as a synonym for mysticism. These words are often used interchangeably when referring to the same experience. Underhill's definition is as follows: mysticism is the art of union with reality. The mystic is a person who has attained union in greater or lesser degree, or who aims at or believes in such attainment. Underhill 5. The attainment of union with reality is usually characterized as a mystical experience. Enlightenment, as I am using it in this paper, refers to union with reality. Some refer to that reality, however, by different names such as God, the good, the ineffable, oneness, emptiness, the void, or silence. Precisely what Plato believes this reality to be can be uncovered in the pages of the Republic. It can be argued that the word mysticism in the manner to which we are referring was a term introduced to the West by Dionysius the Areopagite aka Pseudo-Dionysius for centuries. He was regarded as a preeminent theologian of Christendom, where nearly every great medieval scholar made use of his writings, and his authority came to be almost final. Dionysius I. Dionysius was thought to be a disciple of St. Paul. However, later scholars found this to be false, as it was clear that his writings were Neoplatonic in nature, and could not have been written during the time of St. Paul. They showed a much later date of 5th to early 6th century. The writings of Dionysius are mystical in nature and called attention to the transcendence of God, and his ineffable nature. Of the ineffable nature of God, he writes, "It is not soul or mind, nor does it possess imagination, conviction, speech, or understanding. Nor is it speech per se, understanding per se. It cannot be spoken of and it cannot be grasped by understanding. It is not number or order, greatness or smallness, equality or inequality, similarity or dissimilarity. It is not immovable, moving or at rest. It has no power, it is not power, nor is it light. It does not live nor is it life. It is not a substance, nor is it eternity or time. It cannot be grasped by the understanding, since it is neither one nor oneness, divinity nor goodness. Nor is it a spirit, in the sense in which we understand that term. It is not sonship or fatherhood, and it is nothing known to us or to any other being. It falls neither within the predicate of non-being nor of being. Existing beings do not know it as it actually is, and it does not know them as they are. There is no speaking of it, nor name nor knowledge of it." Dionysius II. The experience of the ineffable quality of God is demonstrated clearly in this text as being so transcendent, that it cannot be spoken of, for there are no words or thoughts to describe it. In other words, it is beyond all categories of thought or anything humanly conceivable. To name it is to profane it and bring it into perceptible human terms. Naming a God or even eternal makes it into something which is antithetical to its ineffable nature. One must remain silent. This recalls Plato's Parmenides and his paradoxical claim of the one over many theory, in which he assumes a connection between the one and many. It is paradoxical, because if something is one, it follows logically that it cannot have parts, or be said to change or become a multiplicity, or else it loses its oneness. However, in this case, the paradox lies in naming something that is by its very nature nameless, but Dionysius seems to be anticipating the inclination to name it. Thus, the exhortation "there is no speaking of it, nor name, nor knowledge of it too." This is but one description of a mystical experience in terms of encountering the ineffable nature of God. However, as we shall see, there are many other mystical experiences that, although different from each other in some ways, are evidence of a universal phenomena. My point here is to describe mystical experiences, to bolster the point I want to make later in this work, namely, that Plato, too, was a mystic, and his dialogues reflect this. It is clear that although mystics claim the experience to be ineffable or beyond description, they nevertheless attempt to describe them anyway. Therefore, let us explore some descriptions of mystical experiences. In the interest of structure, let us start with Western mystics and then move on to Eastern mystics. However, before doing this, I will digress a bit, and give a brief synopsis of the allegory of the cave and divided line analogy, as they will be used as references in many of the descriptions of mystical experiences we will talk about. Later, we will expound upon them. The divided line is an analogy Plato uses to express degrees of reality and being. The line is divided into 4 unequal segments. The proportions of the lengths reflect the degree to which one is farther or nearer to reality. The 2 lower rungs of the line, if viewed vertically, are said to be at the level of images equasia and opinion pistis, where one is furthest away from grasping reality. The 2 higher rungs are said to be understanding dianonia and knowledge gnosis, where one has achieved, cognitively speaking, a higher grasp of reality. Indeed, at the level of knowledge ultimate reality is perceived. Plato refers to this ultimate reality as the good. The main divisions between the lower and higher levels, however, are the visible world perceived by sense perception and the intelligible world perceived by the intellect or mind's eye. In the allegory of the cave, Plato expounds on the degrees of reality and being. He does it by way of an allegory, in which groups of prisoners have been chained deep in a cave since birth. They are so immobilized by the chains they are forced to look forward at a wall. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway, the length of which, objects such as animals, plants, and statues are paraded across, thus casting shadows onto the wall. Further behind them is the opening of the cave that leads outside. The prisoner compelled to leave the cave begins eventually to free himself and turn his head, for the first time, toward the light. The prisoner's turn toward the light of the fire is the first step up the ladder of cognitive perception to greater degrees of reality and being. At the level of fire, which casts shadows on the wall, equates to level of opinion of the divided line, whereas the shadows that are cast on the wall equate with images. Eventually, the prisoner makes his way outside the cave, where he sees objects, as they really are without images and shadows. This reflects the higher rungs of cognitive perception of understanding and knowledge. This level is Plato's ultimate goal in terms of encountering truth and reality. These are brief synopses of the divided line and the allegory of the cave, to aid the reader in understanding some of the ideas related to degrees of cognitive perception. Therefore, let us return to our discussion of mystical experiences. The mystical tradition offers a vast well to draw from, but for the purposes of this paper I will discuss only a few. My intention is not to get into a comparative analysis of the whole of mystical literature, but only to draw out commonalities as necessary. In terms of Western mysticism, a mystic worth mentioning is Plotinus 204-270 CE. He was born in Hellenistic Egypt but studied philosophy under Ammonius Saccas, a Neoplatonist in Alexandria, the hub of education in the ancient world. He later became a scholar and taught in Rome. Neoplatonists were essentially Platonists, who tried to fuse the Christian doctrine with Platonic ideas like the good. Plotinus' central idea is that the universe consists of a series of emanations stemming from a one. This one is free of multiplicity and undifferentiated until emanations flow from it. There is a descending order of emanations that ultimately lead to its fall into matter, and there is an ascending order that leads to a union with the one. Plotinus' ideas are reflected in Enneads, which are a collection of his works put together by his student Porphyry Plotinus Xylii. In it, he writes about a mystical vision of the one, but in the vision, that which sees is not reason but something greater than and prior to reason, something presupposed by reason, as is the object of vision. He who then sees himself, when he sees will see himself as a simple being, will be united to himself as such, will feel himself become such. We ought not even to say that he will see, but that he will be that which he sees, if indeed it is possible any longer, to distinguish seer and seen, and not boldly to affirm that the two are one. In this state, the seer does not see or distinguish or imagine two things, he becomes another, he ceases to be himself and to belong to himself. He belongs to him and is one with him, like two concentric circles, they are one when they coincide, and two only when they are separated. It is only in this sense, that the soul is other. Therefore this vision is hard to describe. For how can one describe, as other than oneself, that which, when one saw it, seemed to be one with oneself? Armstrong 136. I will offer some commentary on this passage, since I think it will be relevant to our discussion later. But in the vision, that which sees is not reason but something greater than and prior to reason, something presupposed by reason, as is the object of vision 136. This passage seems to suggest that reason is useless in perceiving the vision. It follows that this is likely since, as we see further in the passage, he is referring to a vision of unity, he belongs to him and is one with him, like two concentric circles, they are one when they coincide. Reason, which usually involves a comparative judgment, meaning a comparison made relative to the objects you are measuring against, seems blunted in an undivided, or non-multiple, world. Why? Because there is nothing to compare, all is one. The seeing, thus, seems to result, not from reason but as the passage suggests, from something greater than and prior to reason. What can this be? I would like to suggest here it is the mind's eye noetic perspective, or, in terms of Plato's divided line analogy, understanding at the intelligible level beyond sense perception. We ought not even to say that he will see, but that he will be that which he sees, if indeed it is possible any longer, to distinguish seer and seen. This passage seems to imply that seer and seen are one. In this respect, a vision may seem misleading, as it presupposes a subject-to-object relationship, a seer-subject, who sees a vision object. This point is the cause of much confusion and difficulty in understanding Enlightenment experiences. This point is also key to understanding my thesis, as I will later attempt to show that Plato is attempting to achieve this blurring of subject-to-object vision through his dialogues. This involves the many becoming the one. What is interesting about Plotinus' brand of mysticism is that, like Plato, his approach was more intellectual and discursive than religious, as the term religion is usually understood, that is, an approach that involves accepting doctrines or beliefs on faith. Plotinus' unifying experience created tensions among theistic religions. According to W. T. Stuss, a scholar of mysticism of some renown, theistic religions believe that there is a great gulf between God and man, creator and creature, which nothing can bridge. 128. They are distinct substances. So for man to claim to be one with God would be blasphemous. He points out that the propensity for Christian mystics to want to transcend duality and enter into union with God created problems between ecclesiastical authorities of the Roman Church. Many were accused of heresy. One such mystic was Meister Eckhart, who said, "My eye and God's eye are one and the same, and God and I are one." Blackney 97. Meister Eckhart, a Christian theologian, was born in Germany 1260-1327. He was famous for composing sermons and using interesting terms to describe the mystical experience. For instance, he used the phrase "the birth of Christ in a soul," which seems to be a reference to a beginning stage of mystical development. Stuss 140. A birth presupposes a maturing or gradation of some kind to higher stages of development, not unlike Plato's divided line, as we shall see later. He goes on to express how difficult this experience is to achieve. The birth, he says, is impossible without a complete withdrawal of the senses, and great force is required to repress all the agents of the soul, and causes them to cease to function. It takes much strength to gather them all in, and without the strength it cannot be done. Black Me 109. The birth of the Christ within, the passage suggests, involves a withdrawal of the senses. Why? It is, cognitively speaking, when objects of thought, that involve things derived from the senses are transcended. The repressing of agents presupposes a state of multiplicity, that must be harmonized or brought into a one. The term Christ seems to symbolize the mystical experience, which can only be achieved if senses cease to function. This seems to align nicely, as we shall see later, with Plato's tripartite theory of the soul and its harmonizing. In the mid-16th century, Teresa of Avila, a Carmelite nun from Spain, wrote in her autobiography the following passage about her mystical experience: "The persons who must speak of it are those who know it, for it cannot be understood, still less described." As I was about to write of this, I was wondering what it is the soul does during the time referring to mystical experience, when the Lord said these words to me: "It dies to itself wholly, daughter, in order that it may fix itself more and more upon me. It is no longer itself that lives but I." Piers 119. This clearly shows a unifying experience that is common to mystical experiences. The statement that it is no longer itself but I demonstrates a union with God. This is one of the first instances in which we see the use of God rather than the term ineffable. The experience seems to be suggesting a merging of the soul with the Godhead. Teresa of Avila was also known for hearing voices. However, they were regarded as an inner hearing rather than an audible one. Saint John of the Cross, a contemporary of Teresa of Avila, was also part of the Carmelite order and Teresa's spiritual advisor. He similarly contends that in order to achieve a unifying experience with God, that the soul must be emptied of all these forms, figures, and images, and it must remain in darkness in respect to these internal senses, if it is to attain divine union. Stus 185. It is apparent that until the soul's internal senses are purged it cannot achieve union. This suggests a move, cognitively speaking, from the level of sense perception to a cognitively higher perception similar to abstract thinking, or in a Kantian sense, the realm of a prioris, that is knowledge or concepts, that are derived from intuitions rather than experience. Mathematical concepts are perfect examples of a priori knowledge. Geometry, for instance, involves spatial reasoning more than experience-based reasoning, in other words, reason based in intuition. This corresponds to Plato's intelligible world, as we shall see later. Another Western mystic of note is January van Ruysbroek. He was a Flemish mystic from Brussels, born in 1293. The story goes that because he was dissatisfied with being a cathedral chaplain, he left Brussels to seek refuge in a hermitage on the outskirts of town. He devoted himself to the inner life of the spirit. Stus 158. Gradually, he developed a following and lived a contemplative life. Some of his expressions of mystical consciousness resemble Meister Eckhart's, like the Christ born within. He taught that to attain mystical union it is necessary to empty the mind of sensations, images, and thoughts. 158. He wrote, "Such enlightened men are, with a free spirit, lifted above reason into a bare and imageless vision, wherein lies the eternal indrawing summons of the divine unity, and with an imageless and bare understanding they reach the summit of their spirits." Skenk 185. Rising above reason seems to be an essential feature in mystical experiences. An imageless vision seems to be an inference to a cognitive step above sense perception to Plato's world of intelligibles. And as the passage suggests, the imageless vision is the point at which the spirit is summoned or drawn to the divine unity. This recalls Plato's dialectic method, which, as a stepping stone, leads to a higher cognitive perception of the forms or the good. I mean that which reason itself grasps by the power of the dialectic. It does not consider these hypotheses as first principles but truly as hypotheses, but as stepping stones to take off from, enabling it to reach the unhypothetical first principle of everything. 511b. Islamic mysticism, which I shall group with the Western mysticism, is called Sufism. It is regarded as the esoteric side of Islam. The name Sufi means wool, which some say was a nickname for the early Muslim mystics who wore wool clothing. Sufism flourished in Arab and Persian countries. Stus 201. Precisely when and where it originated from is not known, only that it probably started around the 9th century CE. 201. In Turkey, Sufis were known for their ruling, which led to a higher unified state. Early Sufi mystics were panentheistic, believing creation and creator were one. However, this view creates tension with some Orthodox Muslims, who held ideas similar to the Christian Orthodox. They think that any identification of being one with God is blasphemous. For instance, a Sufi mystic, Al-Hallaj 922 CE, once claimed that he was one with God, and was later crucified in Baghdad. Stus 200. There is another great Sufi worth mentioning. His name is Al-Ghazali 1058-1111. However, there is not enough to go on to determine if he achieved a mystical experience. He was more a scholar of philosophy, science and theology, who wrote many seminal works. He was said to be the Islamic Thomas Aquinas of his day. It is worth noting, however, that his position was wholly sympathetic to the mystic claim to immediate experience of God, and one of his central aims was to reconcile Sufism and Islam orthodoxy. Stus 203. However, a mystic more of the variety we are seeking is Abu Yazid 804-874 Brown 141. He was a Persian mystic from Bastam, Iran, who was one of the first Sufis to speak about the mystical experience in terms of a unitive experience, as the following passage illustrates. Creatures are subject to changing states, but the Gnostic has no state, because his vestiges are effaced, and his essence annihilated by the essence of another, and his traces are lost in another's traces. Nicholson 18. Once again, this seems to be another unification process, as essence dissolves into another essence. Essence annihilation and the resulting sense of oneness are key to understanding the nature of the mystical experience. The annihilation occurs when subject and object are merged. Jalal ad-Din Rumi, who lived in the 13th century, is probably one of the better celebrated Sufis. He was and still is considered a poet, who expressed his poetry in mystical terms. His most famous poem is called the Mathanoi, in which he writes about the vision of one by using light, as an analogy for God. The lamps are different, but the light is the same. It comes from beyond. Fix your gaze upon the light and you are delivered from dualism inherent in the finite body. Nicholson 166. The urge to fix one's gaze on the light seems to be inviting a deeper understanding of the lamp, much deeper than what sense perception can offer, apparently. The light is clearly eternal in nature, but the lamp, which embodies the light and differs in appearance, suggests change. Change, as we will see in Plato's dialogues, is associated with sense-perception, or the world of becoming, whereas things that are immutable or eternal belong to the world of being. The lamp, therefore, can be seen as a metaphor for the body becoming and the light, the soul being. The gazing at the light which is eternal, thus results in the transcendence of dualism. We have yet another unifying experience. Of the two Eastern mystical traditions, Confucianism and Taoism, the latter seems more mystically oriented and thus more relevant to our survey. Confucius seems to be more known for what can be described as codes of conduct. Although his writings are filled with wise sayings, and may reflect an enlightened consciousness, like Al-Ghazali, there is not enough to go on to prove it conclusively. Taoism developed out of a book Tao Ching, written by Lao Tzu 570 BCE. The word Tao literally means the way. The meaning of way is best described in poem number 4 in the Tao. The way, it says, is a void, which is never filled but out of which all things come. Thus 103. In other words, it is the source of everything. The word void seems paradoxical, however. If it is a void, how can anything come of it? Suzuki, renowned Zen Buddhist scholar, offers an explanation. The void, he says, is a reservoir of infinite possibilities and not just mere emptiness. Differentiating itself and yet remaining itself undifferentiated, we may say that it is a creation out of nothing. Thus 103. The paradox is not an uncommon one. Rather, it seems to be a universally perplexing to all metaphysicians who grapple with first causes, and how something comes out of nothing. The Tao Ching, however, seems to describe a method for achieving enlightenment in poem number 48. Touch ultimate emptiness, hold steady and still. All things work together, I have watched them reverting, and have seen how they flourish and return again, each to his roots. This, I say, is the stillness, a retreat to one's roots, or better yet, return to the will of God, which is, I say, to constancy. The knowledge of constancy call enlightenment, and say that not to know it is blindness that works evil. But when you know what eternally is so, you have stature. And stature means righteousness. And righteousness is kingly and kingliness divine, and divinity is the way which is final. Then, though you die, you shall not perish. Black Knee 53-101. Touching ultimate emptiness can be viewed as transcending duality, where multiplicity is non-existent. The turning to the roots seems to be a method for getting there, and recalls the prisoner of Plato's allegory of the cave turning in the direction of the light. It also seems clear that it is a reference to essence or being. Knowing what is eternally, so which is equated with righteousness and kingliness, leads to not perishing, but smacks of immortality, a belief espoused in the dialogues. Although it can be argued that Dionysius disseminated many of the ideas regarding mystical experiences, the same can be said of Hinduism and Buddhism, though the experience is usually referred to as enlightenment. Indeed, the sense in which mysticism is understood today stems from them. The Hindu tradition is rich with mystical experiences. In fact, according to W.T. Stas, the mysticism reflected in the Upanishads is remarkably similar to the more contemporary mysticism of Sri Aurobindo, despite the fact that they are separated by a 3,000-year span. Stas argues that this is not surprising given that mystical consciousness is the same in all ages. 49. Most of what we know about Hindu mysticism comes from the Upanishads. The Upanishads are said to be the work of anonymous Indian forest dwellers, who lived between 3,000 and 2,500 years ago. 20. They are among the oldest records of mysticism in the world, and are comprised of multiple texts like the Mandukya Brihadaranyaka, Jaiminiya and Aitareya, to name a few. From the Mandukya we get the following description of the mystical experience: it is beyond the senses, beyond the unitary consciousnesses, wherein awareness of the world and of multiplicity is completely obliterated. 20. Likewise, from the Upanishads there is another passage, which describes the value of self-reflection. The self, Maitri, is to be known. Hear about it, reflect upon it, and meditate upon it. By knowing the self, my beloved, through hearing, reflection, and meditation, one comes to know all things. Manchester 68-60. In these two passages, we find the familiar downplaying of the senses and multiplicity. But there is also the urging of self-reflection and meditation, which leads one to know all things. Could there be a connection between self-reflection and enlightenment? There clearly is. The self seems to be the doorway to uncovering the truth. It is the lens through which the world is viewed or perceived. We will explore the idea of self later. Sri Aurobindo, as mentioned earlier, is a more contemporary Hindu mystic, born in India in 1872 and educated at Cambridge, England. He later became a professor of English literature. Although his writings appear to be influenced by the Upanishads, they were not reproductions of the ancient texts. Stus 49. Stus cautions against this, and argues that Hindu mystics are by nature spiritually inclined, not copyist. Sri Aurobindo wrote many books, but his mystical writings are captured in the Life of the Divine, in which he writes about a mystical experience. At the gates of the transcendent stands that mere and perfect spirit described in the Upanishads, luminous, pure, sustaining the world, without flaw of duality, without scar of division, unique, identical, free from all appearance of relation and multiplicity, the pure self, the inactive Brahman, the transcendent silence. And the mind, when it passes those gates, suddenly receives a sense of the unreality of the world and the sole reality of the silence, which is one of the most powerful and convincing experiences, of which the human mind is capable. Aurobindo 1-6. The phrase free from all appearance of relation and multiplicity seems to reference a reality beyond appearance sense perception, which is the sole reality of the silence. This sounds like a unifying experience, but is characterized as silence. The ineffable quality recalls Dionysius' description of the ineffable quality of God. In this sense, it is so transcendent as to be silent. Pure self suggests an awareness without an object or a self, that does not say I. Saying I introduces dualism or multiplicity. In other words, it creates the subject-to-object relationship. Awareness without identification with I is pure self. The discovery of the pure self, as the most profound experience a human mind can experience, is a common sentiment among mystics. There is no doubt that the experience is life-altering. With regard to Buddhism, when recounting the story of the Buddha, there is the obligatory disclaimer: little is known about him. Much of what we do know is from second-hand sources. His name was Siddhartha Gautama, one who has achieved his goal. He was an Indian prince born circa 550 BCE, and as the story goes he lived a sheltered life behind the walls of his father's palace, wanting for nothing. The main reason he was sheltered was due to a prophecy, that one day he would either become a great king or a great holy man. Wanting an heir, his father did everything in his power to ensure his son would be king, including preventing him from leaving the palace walls. He was determined to do anything to prevent his arousal to the holy life. However, Siddhartha felt a stirring within and wanted to see what lay beyond the walls. His father reluctantly agreed and allowed him to leave. While outside the walls, he encountered an old man, a diseased man, and a decaying corpse, and was puzzled. His charioteer, Channa, explained to him that everyone will grow old one day, get sick and die. Profoundly moved by the suffering and misery, he abandoned his sheltered life, including his beautiful wife and child, to join a monastic sect in hopes that they would provide answers on how to end suffering. India at the time had monastic schools or sects that taught their own methods to achieve enlightenment. Siddhartha practiced with most of them and even became adept at various meditative and extreme ascetic practices, but failed to reach his goal of finding a solution for ending suffering. Disillusioned with the schools and what he had learned up to that point, he resolved to sit under a Bodhi tree. Come rain or shine, or death, he would remain there until he achieved enlightenment. On the seventh day, so the legend goes, he reached enlightenment. Thereafter he was known as the Buddha or the awakened. Lamekis 12. To what did he awaken? Scholars have often debated about what awakening really means. But the general consensus seems to be, even though there is no direct description from the Buddha himself, that he achieved an ineffable transcendental state or experience of direct and intuitive understanding of the ultimate nature of phenomena. Stus 68. His ideas are captured in the Pali Canon Lamekis 47. They were written 100 years after his death, and are considered the oldest records reflecting what the Buddha actually taught. The following passage is a quote often cited and found in the Pali Canon: there is, monks, that plane, where there is neither extension, nor motion, nor the plane of infinite ether, nor that of neither perception nor non-perception, neither this world nor another, neither the moon nor the sun. Here, monks, I say that there is no coming, or going or remaining or deceasing or uprising, for this is itself without support, without continuance in samsara, without mental object. This is itself the end of suffering. There is, monks, an unborn, not become, unmade, uncompounded, and were it not, monks, for this unborn, not become, not made, uncompounded, no escape could be shown here, for what is born, has become, is made, is compounded. But because there is, monks, an unborn, not become, unmade, uncompounded, therefore an escape can be shown, for what is born, has become, is made, is compounded. Cons 94-95. This passage is admittedly confusing. The Buddha seems to suggest, however, that there is a plane, wherein it is possible by means of arriving at a state of non-perception without mental object, to result in ending suffering. Cognitively this appears to imply a blurring of subject-to-object relationship - a unifying or dissolving into a one. This explains paradoxical statements like neither perception nor non-perception, or neither this world nor another. In a state of unity nothing can be said about it, or else the said thing renders it no longer a one. The ineffable quality is part and parcel of a sense of oneness. As an aside, the peculiar thing about Buddha, unlike other mystics we have seen, is that he repudiated any idea of a supreme being, self or soul. The reason for this seems to be, that because his sole aim was to end suffering, he did not concern himself with issues like first causes or a supreme being. In a sense, he was a pragmatist, and cared only about the matter at hand and not what could not be proven. The notion of self, or soul, is a bit confusing. On the one hand, he believed there was no I or self that persisted through time, yet he believed in reincarnation. The only way of getting around this paradox is if we consider that what he intended was to end immortality by achieving nirvana, a blowing out which extinguishes self. That way, self disappears. In this light, it can be understood what he meant by no I. The issue then appears to be a matter of semantics. When it comes to demonstrating that all mystical experiences are similar, I defer to W.T. Stuss's analysis, which acknowledges differences in mystical experiences reported by different cultures, or different ages, but nevertheless sees a number of common characteristics. 14. He believes, as do I, the differences are very superficial. However, the chief feature, which he argues is common to all mystical experiences, involves an apprehension of an ultimate non-sensuous unity in all things, a oneness, a one to which neither sense nor reason can penetrate. He characterizes experiences that lack this central feature as borderline experiences. 14. Moreover, according to the W.T. Stuss, these experiences can further be divided into 7 features: 1. A unifying vision and perception of the one; 2. The apprehension of the one as an inner life; 3. An objective and true sense of reality; 4. Feelings of satisfaction, joy, and bliss; 5. A religious element, that is a feeling of the holy and sacred; 6. A paradoxical feeling; and 7. An inexpressible feelings. 131. Stuss also divides the experiences into 2 categories: introversion mysticism, meaning an experience characterized as absolute undifferentiated and distinctive changeless unity, in which all multiplicity has been obliterated. 35. And extroversion mysticism, an experience that involves making use of sense perception, and coming to see objects in nature transfigured in such a manner that the unity shines through them. 15. The distinction is that the former experience entails going inward, to have a mystical experience, whereas the latter involves one looking outward. Stuss believes the extroversion to be inferior to the introversion experience. The introversion is the full experience. Stuss associated introversion mystics with Christian mystics, i.e., Eckhart and Ruysbroek, and almost all Hindu and Buddhist mystics. He believes the experiences are wholly unknown to, and independent of one another. Stuss 36. In other words, they are universal experiences, that occur in all cultures, and have been occurring from time immemorial. This, incidentally, adds more credibility to my thesis, that Plato was also a mystic. One need only look for some of the features common to the experience, to uncover the truth of this fact. However, much of the criticism of mysticism is that it is seen as a purely subjective experience, that can tell us little about the outside world. Although the mystics have given us descriptions of their mystical experiences, the nature of the experience makes it inherently at odds with language, as language is made of conceptualizations. As we have seen, the tendency of mystics is to refer to the experience as ineffable. This presents a problem. To say that 10 is ineffable is to say something about 10, which contravenes ineffability. Plantinga 23-25. Whether the experience is described as ineffable, silence or God, it appears to be only a matter of semantics. Mystical descriptions are often confusing and paradoxical. Frequently myths and metaphors are often used to explain the experience. Barker illustrates the function of myths or metaphors in the following passage: perhaps, the myths are neither true nor false, but distanced from reality by being images, of what is real and what is true. They are, that is, fashioned to suit the inadequacies of belief, the state of mind of people enmeshed in a sensible world, susceptible to the persuasive words of poets and orators, who observe what is likely at the expense of what is true. Barker 48. In other words, myths are designed to appeal to mindsets that are of the lower rung of cognitive perception. The truth is framed in images, to make it more amenable or understandable. However, if the mystical experience could be reduced to only few chief features that characterize the experience the best, I would propose just two: 1. A sense of unity, which transcends sense perception and reason, and 2. A powerful and life-altering experience. Let us conclude, then, what enlightenment is. It is a unifying experience in which the mystic has pure awareness, and is free of content or subject-object relationships. The pure consciousness is so pure there is no other content other than itself. And since it has no content, it is described as ineffable, as a one, God or emptiness. To use an analogy to help illustrate the point, picture an eyeball staring into a mirror. In gazing at the mirror, the eye will see an image of itself. Now let us suppose that the eye decides it wants to see itself. How will it do this? We know the image in the mirror is just a reflection and not the eye itself. Can the eye turn around and see itself? It is obvious it cannot. The first step in the eye wanting to see itself is the realization that the image in the mirror is a reflection image and not the eye. The eye will then become self-aware. In other words, its gaze will no longer be directed toward the image but inwardly at itself. This is analogous to a subject-to-object merging. What is occurring, without the metaphor, is that the self is reflecting on itself. The self, which usually maintains a self-conceptualization equated with the image in the mirror, no longer identifies itself with it but rests in pure awareness. Another analogy would be to imagine a screen and projector. The images projected onto the screen are analogous to the mirror and the screen to the eye or self. Identifying with screen and not projections is another analogy for subject-to-object merging. It is important to note that this process always involves a turn inward. This is evident in Socrates' call to know thyself. Charmides 164d 165a. Self-inquiry, therefore, into the nature of self is part and parcel of any sincere request for what is real. To begin the process of drawing parallels with what has already been said about enlightenment and Plato's Republic, let us begin by making some preliminary points. I argue that the dialogues of the Republic demonstrate precisely how to achieve enlightenment. Its aim, I believe, is to direct the soul nearer to the truth. This involves a progression up the steps of cognitive perceptions of image, belief, and understanding to ultimate reality, or the good. I contend that the process of education, which the Republic is supposedly about, is a way of preparing the conditions to achieve enlightenment, a converting of the tripartite soul from many into one. Part of the long discourse on justice, and how it relates to the tripartite theory of the soul and the state, is meant to show how the soul of many becomes the one. Or, as Dorder suggests, the narrative displays a progressive ascent through opposition in the direction of greater inclusiveness, which is perhaps intended as a literary image of the noetic dialectic Dorder 4. Noetic Greek - meaning inside means intuitive understanding, which suggests a deeper cognitive perception. In the noetic sense, the dialectic as Dorder refers to it, is the means by which the soul can rise to level of the good. Moreover, the cave and divided line, I believe, are a more focused and discursive attempt at explaining what enlightenment is. Plato does this by showing the cognitive progression from ordinary consciousness to enlightenment. For instance, the categories of the divided line such as image, belief, understanding and knowledge are the stages in the development of enlightenment. Knowledge then corresponds to the merging of subject to object. When reading the dialogues, Plato follows a few rules, which are good to keep in mind. These, I suggest, will be clues in support of my thesis, that Plato's sole aim is to bring the soul nearer to the truth or enlightenment, which is a unifying experience, and that Plato himself is a mystic. The first rule, he never refers to the visible world or world of sense perception, except through metaphor. His only concern is the good and the noetic thought, mathematical thinking, that impels the thinker's soul to view the good itself. Second, he never refers to a multiplicity of parts, only the whole or pure oneness. It is also important to note that the books of the Republic are written in dialogue form, in which Socrates and at least one other person are engaged in a fictitious conversation. Essentially, Plato uses Socrates as his mouthpiece, to espouse his own ideas. In all the ensuing dialogues, where Socrates is seen as constantly refuting ideas put forward by his interlocutors, who demonstrate multiple points of view, world of opinion or belief, Socrates always looks for a unity, a oneness. This is referred to as the elenchus dialectic, which is a form of cross-examination, where a statement is made, and series of questions are then asked about the statement and an effort is made to determine if the statement is true. After the cross-examination, however, the original statement turns out to be false. Another series of questions are then asked to probe the inconsistencies, or wrong assumptions of the original statement until the truth is made self-evident. In this respect, Socrates seemed to be a walking refutation. His certainty of the refutation gives the feeling that he was privy to knowledge that others were unaware of. However, his position was always "I know that I know nothing." Apology 21d. This is demonstrated in a passage in the Charmides: "You treat me as if I professed to know the matters I ask about, and as if I might agree with you if I wished to. But that is not so. On the contrary, I inquire into the proposition along with you because I do not know. I will tell you whether I agree or not, when I have examined it." 165. This is a method used by Plato through the character of Socrates mainly throughout Book I. More broadly, the dialectic is used to refer to thinking directed away from thoughts derived from sense perception. I want to suggest here that Plato's method, which has the uncanny ability of arriving at the truth, is symptomatic of a mystical consciousness. It is a mindset that draws everything into a oneness. However, to prove this will require another thesis. The difficulty will lie in cross-examining the writings of other mystics in an effort to detect the drawing of everything into oneness. The difficulty will be compounded when sorting through the diverse ways of articulating the mystical experience and then attempting to find a common thread. So let us continue with our present course. I have already given a brief overview of mystical experiences. Reference to these accounts will show how closely these experiences correspond to Plato's divided line analogy or allegory of the cave in terms of the cognitive progressions through images, belief, understanding and knowledge. However, some discussion will be required here to frame the context in which the divided line and cave are used. Therefore, I will discuss the books in the Republic that precede these analogies and attempt to illustrate the points mentioned previously. What should be noted, however, in the discussion of the dialogues, is Plato's constant interest in the whole and not parts. This is an important key in understanding the mystical nature of his writings. The reason for this, as we shall see, is because parts belong to lower cognitive levels, the realm of the opinion and multiplicity. Seeing things as a whole, or drawing everything into a unity, is an indication of a higher cognitive level. So, with this in mind, let us begin with Book I. Book I begins with an imaginary dialogue between Socrates and Cephalus, a rich elderly man. Socrates asks, "Is life harder toward the end, or what report do you give of it?" 328b. He explains that relative to other men, he lives in justice and holiness. 331. A discussion about what justice is ensues. Cephalus suggests it is to tell the truth, and pay what you owe. 331. Socrates points out a contradiction in his argument, by using an example of giving a weapon, what is owed to a madman. It would prove to be an unjust act, if the madman decided to use it, to harm others. 331c. Cephalus excuses himself before defending his point, and his son, Polemarchus, weighs in and suggests that justice is to help friends and harm enemies. 332e. 333e. Socrates finds inconsistencies that result in finding the just man useless in peacetime, and concluding that justice cannot be used to harm, because it is antithetical to the nature of justice. He makes the point by giving a series of examples. For example, he asks if the musician by his art can make men unmusical, to which Polemarchus replies, "Certainly not." So it follows, if just is the good, then to injure a friend or anyone else is not the act of a just man, but of the opposite. 334b. This then leads to Thrasymachus' assertion that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger. 335bd. In other words, right is might and justice an invention of the strong, who have been shrewd enough to lay down the rules of the game of life in their own interest for the weaker and less wise to obey. 45. Socrates immediately sees a discrepancy in this argument. Socrates, let me first understand you. Justice, as you say, is the interest of the stronger. What, Thrasymachus, is the meaning of this? You cannot mean to say that because Polydamas, the Pancratiast, is stronger than we are, and finds the eating of beef conducive to his bodily strength, that to eat beef is therefore equally for our good, who are weaker than he is, and right and just for us? 338c. Thrasymachus replies, "That's abominable of you, sir, Socrates. You take the words in the sense, which is most damaging to the argument." "Not at all, my good sir," Socrates says, "I am trying to understand them, and I wish that you would be a little clearer." 338c. The confusion that often arises after Socrates has pointed out inconsistencies in the assertions of the interlocutor is called aporia, impasse or confusion. This is part of the pattern of his dialectic method. For the interlocutor, this was usually unnerving. However, for Socrates it was the point at which one embarked on a more substantive search for the truth. Thrasymachus clarifies his point by equating the stronger with the government. Socrates then asks if governments are liable to err. 339c. Thrasymachus answers in the affirmative. Socrates argues then, that because the rulers are fallible and could make laws that are not in their interest, it follows that rulers do not always act in their own interest. Moreover, he draws a parallel between practitioners of justice and practitioners of medicine. He argues that practitioners of medicine consider the interests of the body, not medicine. He concludes, therefore, that justice is for the benefit of the ruled, not the ruler himself. 342-343. Thrasymachus counters with a shepherd and sheep analogy. The shepherd equated with the rulers, who fatten or tend the sheep, are doing it to serve their own interest. Since this creates conditions where the ruler's interests are out of sync with the interest of their subjects, the subjects have no choice but to behave unjustly, to pursue their own interest. It is this kind of injustice, he says, in which the criminal is the happiest of men, and the sufferers or those who refuse to do injustice are the most miserable. 344. In other words, the unjust person is happier than the just one. Being unjust, for Thrasymachus, then becomes virtuous and just, its opposite. Socrates addresses what he perceives as a fundamental misuse of the word justice. He does this by establishing the premise that arts like justice are different, by reason of their each having a separate function. 352. For example, the purpose of eyes is to see and the function of ears is to hear, and although we can prune a vine with any kind of knife, we can best do so with a pruning knife. Order 48 Republic 352-353. However, a thing can only perform its function, according to Socrates, if it has virtue or excellence. Blindness is a case in which the virtue of eyes is lacking. Socrates then argues that the function of the soul is living, and since living poorly does not equate well with the good or virtuous aspect of the soul, it must be a vice or injustice. The soul's virtue is justice, which enables living well. 353e. The conclusion is that justice can only be said to perform its function, living a good life. Therefore living unjustly is antithetical to the soul's virtue. Eventually Plato gets Thrasymachus to revise his idea, and agree that the just are the wise and good and the unjust evil and ignorant. 350c. However, later he will insist that Socrates elaborate further on why this is so. What can we conclude from this? Since Plato is concerned with the deeper nature of justice, the form, he seems to be purposefully drawing attention to the more crude conceptions of justice, to use them as examples of what not to think. Moreover, he seems to be laying down the groundwork for a more sophisticated, in-depth, inquiry into the nature of justice. Book 2 starts with Glaucon picking up where Thrasymachus left off. Glaucon remains unconvinced that to be just is better than to be unjust. He asks Socrates to place justice in one of three categories: 1, a kind of good liked for its own sake, with no ulterior motive; 2, a kind of good that is both liked for its own sake and for what comes of it; 3, a good liked for its consequence only, or what it brings, such as making money. Socrates chooses the second category: justice is good for its own sake as well as for its consequences. Glaucon chooses the third category, and tells Socrates his choice is not what most people would choose. However, since there is agreement with regard to the positive consequences of justice, Glaucon wants Socrates to persuade him why justice for its own sake is more appealing. To get the discussion underway, Glaucon offers an explanation of what he thinks are the origins of justice. 357-359. Since Glaucon thinks that suffering experienced at the receiving end of injustice is worse than being on the giving end, he argues that most people would prefer being unjust if given the choice. Those who lack the power to dispatch it will try to avoid suffering, and recognize that it is better to compromise. As a result, they begin to make laws and covenants, and what the laws command they call lawful and just. 359. He concludes that justice is the intermediate point, between doing injustice without paying penalty and suffering injustice without being able to take revenge. Justice is valued, he says, because people are too weak to do injustice with impunity. 359. He further argues that the true man who has enough power to do injustice with impunity, and does not take advantage of it, is a madman. Therefore, justice is something that is done unwillingly. To bolster his point, Glaucon later reveals what he believes human nature to be. He suggests that if given the freedom to do whatever they wanted, and their desires were allowed to roam free, the just man and unjust man would both be caught red-handed traveling the same road. The reason is that the nature of desire is to outdo others, and want more and more. 359d. To further stress his point, he goes into the shepherd and the ring story. The story is about a shepherd who finds a ring that has the power to make him invisible. Given human nature, Glaucon asserts, both the just man and the unjust will be compelled to fulfill their desires, that is for sex or money. This entails stealing, going into people's houses and having sex with anyone they wished. His point is that no one believes justice is good when it is kept private, since, wherever every man thinks he can do injustice with impunity, he does it. 360. In other words, if everyone were allowed to follow his or her natural proclivities, which are egocentric desires, then they would act unjustly. If we possessed the ring, for instance, we would act no differently than the shepherd. For Socrates to find intrinsic value in justice, it must not be by way of Glaucon's premise, that the value of justice is predicated upon its consequences and not for its own sake. Socrates' view is that justice holds some intrinsic value, in and of itself, and is good unconditionally. In other words, no matter what the circumstances, the just man will remain just. 361e. A closer reading of this will show that Socrates is looking for a universal concept of justice, one not subject to opinion. Glaucon, on the other hand, argues that the just only appears to be just in order to gain rewards and honors. Privately they continue to commit unjust acts. Adamantus joins in the discussion in support of Glucken's argument, that acting justly is only done to reap the rewards and benefits of having a good reputation and not for acting justly for its own sake. He presents examples to illustrate his point. He argues that when such luminaries as Homer and Hesiod praise justice, they do it not for its intrinsic value but for its rewards. They praise the rewards it brings and point out the punishment that injustice brings. 60. Adamantus points out that although Homer and Hesiod praise justice, they realize it is also arduous and hard, while injustice is easy and shameful by opinion and law. 60. They believe that unjust people despite their bad behavior become wealthy and reap rewards, while just acts go unrecognized and are often frowned upon. However, the most astonishing point is that even the gods can be bribed to reward the unjust and curse the just. The result appears to be that being unjust is more beneficial than being just. Injustice is never condemned for itself, only for its consequences, as the following passage illustrates. No one has ever blamed injustice or praised justice except with a view to the glories, honors, and benefits which flow from them. 365. Glaucon and Adamantus's line of questioning have set up conditions, in which a more profound argument ensues, proving objectively that justice is preferable to injustice. Socrates must prove unconditionally that being just is more advantageous than being unjust. Socrates does this by way of an analogy between the individual soul and the state. I will tell you, I replied, justice, which is the subject of our enquiry, is, as you know, sometimes spoken of as the virtue of an individual, and sometimes as the virtue of the state. True, he replies. And is not a state larger than an individual? It is. Then the larger quantity of justice is likely to be larger and more easily discernible. 368. Socrates' strategy was to suggest using the good city as a model of the just man. In other words, all the parts in the city would be large-scale representations of smaller-scale components of a just man's soul. With the advantage of this macro perspective, the search for justice and its chief elements could be discerned. 434e 435a. Socrates argues that societies are formed for a specific purpose, namely, to acquire the necessities of life. 368e 372. Individuals, apparently, are not capable of acquiring them alone, but have to gather together into communities, to meet their common goal of subsistence. The success of this arrangement, however, means that each member has to specialize in a particular craft. Hence, he says, carpenters, metal workers, and many other craftsmen of that sort will share our little city, and make it bigger. 370d. However, this results in even more specialized roles, that were key to ensuring that the society operated efficiently, harmoniously, and smoothly. These roles are the guardians, whose chief function is to rule the city, the auxiliary class, soldiers who support the guardians by enforcing its dictates, and the business class, who are the laborers and merchants. Gradually the state increases in size, as the needs to accommodate the different functions grow. For guardians to rule, however, they need a particular set of qualities, that would make them better suited to rule. These qualities, Socrates argues, are embodied in the philosopher. An important prerequisite of the philosophers, however, is that they must be able to grasp eternal or immutable truth. 484. Though rare, another quality is a love of truth. The philosopher must be interested in truth and not opinion. In other words, they will have a love of knowledge, that is eternal in nature and not subject to change. The incompatibility between the love of truth and falsehood is self-evident. They will be necessarily lovers of truth and will detest falsehood, and concern themselves with the ideal reality of things. 484d. Moreover, they cannot be blind like a painter. Plato uses the analogy of a painter, suggesting that painters paint copies of a copy and not the thing itself. In other words, they are as the blind, in that they do not see beyond appearance. Thus, clear sight or knowledge for Socrates is something of a much deeper sort. It involves, he says, fixing one's eyes on the absolute truth, and always with reference to that ideal and in the exactest possible contemplation of it. 484c. It is clear, then, that the philosopher strives for the highest possible knowledge essence and by virtue of possessing it, is better equipped to rule. Plato refers to such a person as the philosopher king. Therefore, a society directed under the auspices of the philosopher king will ensure a harmonious society given that his judgment is informed by absolute truth. Plato reminds us of the peril cities face without the leadership of the philosopher king in the following passage: until philosophers rule like kings, or those who are now called kings, and leading men genuinely and adequately philosophize, that is, until political power and philosophy entirely coincide, while the many natures, who at present pursue either one exclusively, are forcibly prevented from doing so, cities will have no rest from evils. 473d. This arrangement corresponds to Plato's tripartite theory of the soul, which consists of three parts: appetite, spirit and reason. Appetite is associated with eating or sex, spirit with the emotions, and reason with the rational mind. The reason for the division of 3, Socrates argues, is that the same thing will not be willing to do or undergo opposites in the same respect, in relation to the same thing, at the same time. 436. If this occurs, it is evident we are dealing with many things, not one. This explains, therefore, inner conflicts between opposing components like an appetite to eat and desire to fight. Plato is thus wedded to the thesis that each of us is a society of agencies with differing loyalties, that readily produce mental conflict. Clegg 110. Plato believes if these 3 elements exist in a soul, they must also exist in the city. The city is a macrocosm of man's inner nature. In other words, the inner is the outer and outer the inner. 435 BC. Thus, reason corresponds to the guardian class, spirit with the auxiliary class, and appetite, to the business class. And just as the philosopher king must have knowledge to rule, so must the rational part of the tripartite soul, in order for the soul to be harmonious. In other words, all appetitive or spirited flows are controlled and directed by the rational component. They must be drawn into a unity. Each respective component brought into alignment with the will of the rational is defined by Socrates as justice insofar as each is doing one's own work and not meddling with what isn't one's own. 433 of 433b. To retain this condition, however, the 3 cardinal virtues of courage, wisdom and moderation are needed. We will discuss these and more in detail later. It is important to note that if the unity is not maintained and there is a cross-pollination, so to speak, of the different classes, such as a craftsworker tries to become a soldier, or a soldier a ruler, or someone attempts to do all 3, the city will come to ruin. Order 110. Alternatively, if the appetitive and spirited desires are not properly channeled, the soul will likewise come to ruin. However, to aid in the proper channeling of appetitive and spirited desires, a proper education is required. The education of guardians involves physical training for the body and music and poetry for the soul. 376. Education of guardians is essential for the well-being of the city, because it is on their wisdom and guidance the city depends. Plato's chief aim is to make them like pedigree dogs, that like dogs are harsh to the enemy yet gentle and loyal to friends. 375 of 376d. Moreover, education is the way to make guardians cultivated and orderly in terms of having the spirited and appetitive, as well rational natures harmonized. 410e. According to Plato in Book 3, literature and music are essential in creating this harmony in the soul. His notion of music is slightly different from how it is understood today. For Plato, music is similar to speeches or poetry. 398 c. 403. There was no better time to inculcate these positive virtues than when children are young and malleable. He believes the method for instilling these values is through storytelling of gods and heroes. Physical training is to be taught after children are more physically developed. So careful censorship of stories are required to ensure positive tales influence children. Let the censors receive any tale of fiction, he says, which is good, and reject the bad, and we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized ones only. Let them fashion the mind with such tales, even more fondly than they mold the body with their hands, but most of those which are now in use must be discarded. 376e. 370. Plato goes on to distinguish tales that are lies or erroneous representation of the nature of gods and heroes. He references the tale of Uranus and Cronus, suggesting that tales are stories of trouble-mongering gods, that ought certainly not to be lightly told to young and thoughtless persons. If possible, they had better be buried in silence. 370 383 c. All this is to prevent the young from forming poor habits, like quarreling or attaching themselves to worldly objects instead of virtues such as courage and bravery. It is important, according to Plato, to create harmony between the spirited part of the soul and the rational, so the soul is both moderate and courageous. 411. This is all the more objectionable considering that the tales told of the gods usually are held out to be models for society. Tales instead must exalt and encourage virtues such as moderation in drink, sex, food and money. 389e. 390d. Furthermore, if a city is to be well governed, the gods must be seen as the cause of good things, not bad. 380c. Since the young cannot distinguish if the stories are allegorical or literal, it is most important, the tales, which the young first hear, should be models of virtuous thoughts. 375 of 383d. Plato's aim is to steer the minds of those initiated into his education to the good. This can also be seen in his concern for the fear of death, that poets seem to encourage. We must ask the poets, he says, to stop giving their present gloomy account of the afterlife, which is both untrue and unsuitable to produce a fighting spirit. 386c. In other words, the fear of death presupposes an attachment to the world and a deficiency in courage. 395c. For Plato, storytelling and literature are, thus, important tools for shaping character. However, they should be supervised and monitored. In terms of music, Socrates insists that music must imitate the rhythm of someone who lives an ordered and courageous life, not the other way around. In other words, the style and content of speeches must conform to a good character. 399e. 400. Socrates goes on to discuss physical training. Socrates believes that physical training is not responsible for a good soul, but the opposite is true. This entails having the wherewithal to eat and drink in moderation and train, as necessary. 403 DE. A balance between music and physical training is important for forming a cultivated and orderly guardian, or as Socrates says, the person who achieves the finest blend of music and physical training, and impresses it on his soul in the most measured way, is the one we'd most correctly call completely harmonious and trained in music, much more so than the one who merely harmonizes the strings of his instrument. 412 Socrates, asked to expound on the details of the city, also points out that guardians should not possess any private property, beyond what is necessary. 416 D. They are to live in camps with other guardians. They were not allowed to have a surplus of money other than what was received from taxation. 416 E. Moreover, they are forbidden to handle gold or silver. They mustn't be under the same roof as it, wear it as jewelry, or drink from gold or silver goblets. In this way they save themselves and the city. 417 B. Plato believes that this is not only antithetical to their purpose, which is to rule the city, but also thinks it would cause envy and enmity among fellow citizens. 417 B. They are to live simple, frugal lives, secure in their single-minded commitment to serve the city by guarding it from evils both from within and without. Resima 63. Adeimantus, having some concern that the ruler will be unhappy, asks Socrates, how would you defend yourself if someone told you that you aren't making these men very happy? 419. Others own land and enrich themselves, yet the ruler derives very little benefit from being ruler. Socrates responds by reminding them that their goal in building the city was not to make one group outstandingly happy, but to make the whole city so, as far as possible. 420 B. In other words, the city achieves happiness as a whole by virtue of its harmonious parts. Order 101. At this point, Socrates had completed his city. His next step was to identify justice. He does this through a process of elimination. 427 D. Socrates argues if the city is good, it follows that it consists of four cardinal virtues, namely, courage, moderation, justice and wisdom. He suggests that if any of these were found, what's left over will be the ones we haven't found. 427 E. Courage was a power that preserved one's sense of duty. 430. Moderation is the mastery of appetitive and spirited desires by the rational part of the soul. 431 E. The guardians, who have good judgment, possess wisdom, and justice, as we have seen, means that each part is minding its business, so to speak. 428 D. These virtues acting in conjunction with each other create therefore, a kind of healthy, fine condition, and well-being of the soul. 444 E. Book 5 opens with Socrates overhearing Polemarchus whispering to Adeimantus, shall we let it go, or what? 449. Socrates asks what he means, to which Polemarchus reluctantly responds by accusing Socrates of slacking off, and of not dealing with the issue he mentioned in passing regarding women and children. Socrates, leery of the reaction he would receive, responds cautiously. He says he is afraid to slip from the truth, just where it's most important not to. 451a. This leads to a lengthy discussion of the lifestyle of the guardian. However, some important points worth mentioning are that women should be educated in common like men, as following passage demonstrates. Therefore, if we use the women for the same things as the men, they must also be taught the same things. Yes. Now, we gave the men music and poetry and physical training. Yes. Then we must teach these two crafts, as well as those having to do with warfare, to the women also to use in the same way as the men use them. 451e. 452a. This means that women would train with men in gymnasiums, participate in war, and do other duties related to guardians. 457. However, due to the relative weakness of women, they would be assigned lighter duties where necessary. Perhaps the most striking proposal of Socrates is that women and children are to live communally, and to belong in common to all men. The result was that no parent would know their offspring or any child their parent. 457e. The best of society, the guardians are encouraged to breed and produce better quality offspring. Lotteries are held for inferior stock so they could direct the blame on luck rather than the ruler, who discouraged them from having any offspring in the first place. The children that are born to the guardian class are taken away by officials and raised by nurses in a commune in another part of the city. The inferior, on the other hand, are hidden away in an unknown place. 456c. This was necessary, Socrates tells us, if indeed the guardian breed is to remain pure. 456cd. Socrates seems to devise social ordinances to help keep the city free of discord. In his view, it is clear, if we consider Plato's ideal society as a serious proposal, that it would bear very little resemblance to any form of government during Plato's day or the present day. It was against the social habits or social order of his time. As ethically repugnant as some of his ideas are, that is, the communal mothering of children or social hierarchy, his motive is to remove any sense of mine and thine. McLernity. Strict social ordinances will, he tells us, ensure unity, because it abolishes the primary cause of discord. He goes on to say common maintenance by the state removes all temptation either to meanness or cringing McLurnity. In other words, it produces a sense of unity among the members of society. If anything happens to one member, all members of the state feel it. These social ordinances seem to be a measure to improve social conduct and the well-being of society. This is more plausible, if we consider that these social ordinances, that is communal living of women or property sharing, have no intrinsic value in themselves. They relate only to the social circumstance of Plato's city. The ethical value, therefore, is only valued in relation to how beneficial it is to Plato's society. Or, as the scholar Eric asserts, it is a preparation of the soul and those of our neighbor, by discipline and mutual restraint and unselfishness and consideration for others, for the ultimate attainment of spiritual life. Eric 85. Plato's proposal to do away with private property in the family seems particularly disturbing, as it goes against our modern sensibilities or social habits also. However, these attitudes only compel us to look for a deeper meaning. How is it that Plato, who concerned himself with the good and bringing the soul nearer the truth, possesses so harsh an attitude? It doesn't fit his modus operandi. His intent is to make justice and the good the ultimate concern, in order to achieve harmony, not oppress one group in the interest of promoting another. Although it may seem that way, given the hierarchical nature of his social order, the classes are clearly in harmony with society as a whole, provided they are doing what best fits their aptitude. It is important to note that although Plato's Republic sounds like a blueprint for a utopian society, it is something that can never be realized, unless its members are just souls living for no other purpose than for the good of the whole. So, in essence, the society Plato speaks of cannot be instituted given society's propensity for self-centeredness and injustice. The society Plato speaks about, according to Eric, will be composed only of unspoiled souls, for whom the canvas of life has been swept clean of all existing habits of thought and feelings, both oral and social. And so the ground is out from under the objections, which were raised to his Plato's proposal for community of wives and husbands and children. Eric 87. From the standpoint of modern sensibilities and perhaps in Plato's day, as well, the urge to criticize his ideas is perhaps warranted. However, to do so is evidence that one hasn't grasped the deeper meaning, that is, the ideal state is a device used as an analogue of the soul. It is meant to magnify the conditions of an enlightened soul. Plato's harsh proposals, that is the austere living conditions of the philosopher king, or communal living, can be characterized as a form of reorienting the soul, a purging, if you will, to prepare the soul for the upward journey out of the cave and nearer to the truth. So let us return to our discussion of the nature of this truth or knowledge, that the philosopher king possesses. Indeed, the divided line and cave are attempts to explain the nature of this knowledge. Prompted by Glaucon's question, is there anything more important than justice? Socrates replies, the form of good is the most important thing. 540 DE. He argues that it is only in relation to the good, that justice and all virtues become beneficial. To illustrate the nature of the good, he launches into a beautiful analogy of the sun, as it relates to the good or degrees of knowledge. This is where I believe Plato is undertaking a most difficult task, in articulating the mystical experience through reason, especially given that the experience is by its very nature difficult to articulate or put into words. He does, however, preface his discussion when pressed by Glaucon to explain the good. He says he would rather not disgrace himself and look ridiculous trying, because it is too big a topic. 507b. Therefore, he proposed to explain the offspring of the good, the sun, as the visible aspect of the good instead. The source of light is compared to the good, and thus the sun is the offspring of the good. The sun, which illuminates the physical world, is like the good, which illuminates the intelligible world. And just as the eye sees by virtue of the light, the soul sees by virtue of the good from which truth or knowledge is derived. But when they are directed towards objects on which the sun shines, they see clearly and there is sight in them. 508. To not see clearly, he equates to turning one's gaze towards the twilight of becoming and perishing with the opinion. Then she has opinion only, he says, and goes blinking about, and is first of one opinion and then of another, and seems to have no intelligence. 508 to 509. Therefore, like the eyes, as they direct themselves to that which is clearly illuminated by the sun, the soul draws nearer to the truth by virtue of the good, as it illuminates the truth. And the soul is like the eye, when resting upon that on which truth and being shine, the soul perceives and understands and is radiant with intelligence. 508. This analogy demarcates two worlds, one belonging to the physical world visible, the other to the intelligible world. To make it simpler to understand, three things are necessary to see: sense of vision, something visible, and light which serves as the medium by which the visible can be seen. Likewise, you need three things to perceive truth: a soul, an idea, and the good, that illuminates the truth of the ideas. Socrates further illustrates his point, though the divided line analogy. Socrates begins by asking Glaucon to imagine drawing a line and dividing it into two unequal parts. Each part is then subdivided into two additional parts, the visible world and intelligible world. Each segment corresponds to the degrees of knowing or degrees of being 509d. Or as Socrates says, thus there are 4 such conditions in the soul, corresponding to 4 subsection of our line: understanding for the highest, thought for the second, belief for the third, and imaging for the last. Arrange them in the ratio, and consider that each shares in clarity to the degree that the subsection it is set over shares in truth 513e. The lengths of the segments get bigger as one goes up the scale. However, the main division is between the world of sense opinion and the world of ideas knowledge. The lower rung consists of images equal of relative clarity and opacity can 159. And by image Socrates means, first, shadows, then, reflections in water 509e. The next level is the realm of belief pistis. It involves the objects from which the images are reflections of. They are, Socrates says, the originals of these images, namely the animals around us, all the plants, and the whole class of manufactured things 510e. Above this Plato uses the term understanding dianonia to mean mathematical reasoning. Mathematical objects are outside the visible world, yet visible things are used to point to them. Plato illustrates his point in the following passage: they use visible figures, and make claims for their sake of the square itself and the diagonal itself, not the diagonal they draw, and similarly with others 510e. In other words, he uses objects belonging to the visible world, as mathematical concepts, that can be only seen by the mind's eye. Knowledge at this point can only be said to be hypothetical, because no further enquiry can be made. At the highest level of knowledge gnosis, thought is able to pass out of hypotheses, and see first principles with no use of images. In other words, ideas are experienced directly as themselves. To summarize the divided line analogy, the lower rung images reflects the point, at which the soul is furthest away from grasping reality. At this level, the soul is only able to grasp things derived from sense perception, which, incidentally, Plato finds untrustworthy. Things perceived through senses are apt to deceive us. For instance, a branch in water could deceive us in thinking it is curved due to the refraction of light. Moreover, reason on this level does not impel the mind to further analysis. Plato uses the analogy of 3 fingers, and distinguishes between comparing sizes of fingers versus asking questions such as what is bigness or smallness itself 523b. It is clear that to address the question of what is bigness requires a deeper examination beyond the limits of the senses. Why? Because senses involve a comparison between 2 objects that are relative to one another. That is, one finger is bigger or smaller than the other one. Asking what bigness is, on the other hand, implies an absolute standard, which necessitates an analysis beyond simply observing that one object is bigger or smaller than the other. In order to rise above this cognitive level, one has to disassociate from the body, or, as renowned scholar Paul Shorey states, truth and reality are attained only by the pure thought of the soul acting independently of the body. Shorey 69. Indeed, the more identified with the body, the further away from the truth one is. This is clearly demonstrated in the following passage in Phaedo: then he will do this most perfectly who approaches the object with thoughts alone, without associating any sight with his thought, or dragging in any sense perception with his reasoning, but who, using pure thought alone, tries to track down each reality pure and by itself, freeing himself as far as possible from eyes and ears, and in a word, from the whole body, because the body confuses the soul, and does not allow it to acquire truth and wisdom. Whenever it is associated with it, will not that man reach reality? If anyone does 65e66a. So, the soul has a poor grasp of reality at the level of images. However, Plato explains that when we grasp the objects of sense perception themselves, i.e. animals, trees or what have you, we are in a state of opinion or belief. This is to say, an uncritical perception of reality is maintained, which does not attempt to look beyond appearance. At this level, critical analysis goes as far as differentiating between an object and its image only. In other words, the object is accepted as a given. Opinion at this level is the best one can attain. At the next level, opinion or belief, a greater power of critical analysis and reasoning is developed. This allows for a deeper grasp of reality. This entails employing the use of the mind's eye and thinking in mathematical terms. This will play a crucial role in terms of bridging the cognitive levels that eventually lead to a subject-object. The next and highest level understanding enables the soul to go beyond mathematical principles or hypotheses to absolute truths that inform reality. Objects here are seen directly. Plato refers to these as forms. They are the models from which sensible objects or mathematical objects are copies. In other words, the forms are the perfect models from which sensible objects are imperfect copies. For instance, Brookshields beauty is an imperfect copy of the form beauty. Or a ball is the imperfect copy of the form roundness. The imperfect copies are said to partake in the forms but are not the forms themselves. The forms are eternal and exist according to some, in a transcendental realm. To many, the forms are the central feature in Plato's philosophy. However, some find the ideas problematic. Some of the criticism against Plato's idea of forms is that if the forms are eternal and perfect, and sensible objects are imperfect copies, how is it they relate to one another? Aristotle was opposed to Plato's ideas for this very reason. Although Aristotle believed in forms, for him they were not perfect models in the transcendental realm, rather they were incorporated in the substance of the visible world. Another criticism of Platonic forms is found in the one-over-many argument, which is expressed in the Parmenides dialogue. In it, he appears to anticipate objections to the forms. The crux of the argument relates to the paradoxes of the one-over-many argument. Parmenides detects a contradiction in the argument, namely, how can the one be the many? One many implies separateness. Or, as Parmenides states, one and the same thing will exist as a whole at the same time in many separate individuals, and will therefore be in a state of separation from itself. Parmenides 131b. Parmenides elaborates further by indicating that the one cannot be many, because the one would be made up of parts. Parmenides 131 BC. And therefore the one would be the many, not the one. Parmenides 131 BC. Socrates replies, nay, but the idea may be like the day, which is one and the same in many places at once, and yet continuous with itself. In this way each idea may be one and the same in all at the same time. Parmenides 131 BC. This appears to resolve the issue until Parmenides presses Socrates further, by showing that any change to one suggests a fundamental change in the very nature of oneness. In other words, the one by means of becoming many suggests motion. Moreover, when one changes or moves, it ceases to be itself. Motion suggests movement from one place to another, which is clearly contradictory to the nature of oneness. The rest of the dialogue consists of arguments made in the same vein, that attempt to systematically dismantle Plato's notion of forms, which entails a two-world view, that of ideas forms and a sensible world, which according to Plato, are shadows of the forms. Forms, for Plato, however, exist only in the soul or mind. Miller 54. Parmenides essentially demonstrates, through rigorous logic, the consequences of such a world view. He reasons that the two worlds are diametrically opposed to each other in terms of the relationship between forms and sensible objects. In other words, there is an irreconcilable gap between the two worlds. If the absolute is one, it cannot be anything other than what it is. In essence, the one by its very nature is indivisible, immovable and outside of time, and, therefore, there can be no relationship between objects and the forms of which they partake. Moreover, Plato's idea demonstrates an infinite regress called the third man argument. Essentially, this means that if Martin Luther King, Jr. participated in the form of man, it presupposes another form, which explains how both the form man and Martin Luther King, Jr. can be called man, hence, the third man. However, this necessitates yet another form of fourth man, to explain how these relate to the form man, and so on ad infinitum. Find 24. The Parmenides, as mentioned earlier, appears to anticipate opposition to the forms. Plato appears by means of a most rigorous reflection and systematic logic, to uncover the limits of human knowledge and all possible objections to his ideas. This demonstrates a clear awareness on Plato's part, that his ideas are difficult to prove by pure logic or to articulate. Some scholars, however, such as Galfine, believe that Plato's ideas, as they relate to forms, and third-man argument are misunderstood. Find 36. However, my aim is not to get into a philosophical debate about the nature of forms. My purpose is to point out the unity in Plato's ideas, and how this unity relates to the mystical experience. Therefore, I will bypass any further discussion of the forms. Plato continues to illustrate his point of the different levels of reality by using the allegory of the cave 532 of 533d. He starts by asserting, our natural condition in regard to education and ignorance may be pictured as follows. 514a. There are men living in a cave with an opening behind them. They have been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered. 514a. However, since they are chained, and allowed to face forward only in the direction of a wall, they only see the shadows cast on the wall by a fire behind them. The shadows are cast by objects such as vessels, statues or wooden animals carried by passers-by on a raised walkway. The walkway lies in between the fire and wall, which the men are facing. The men take the images, and sounds cast by passers-by as real. However, they are mere appearances or shadows of the objects, not the things themselves. One day, however, one of the men is released and compelled to stand up, and turn around and walk towards the fire. Plato suggests this would be painful, as the fire would be blinding and disorientating. So much so that he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things, whose shadows he'd seen before. 514d. Next, if he gazed directly at the light, Plato asserts, he would be puzzled and not able to discern, if the objects were more real than the shadows. Rather, he would want to flee back into the cave where shadows are more familiar. Then, if the prisoner is dragged outside of the cave, he would be further dazzled, and blinded by the sun, only gradually becoming accustomed to the sight of the upper world. 516a. He will not see shadows, imitations or reflections of objects but the objects themselves. The shadows on the wall and objects casting them are analogous to images and belief on the divided line, whereas the world outside the cave is equivalent to the intelligible world. The closer the prisoner comes to the entrance of the cave and eventually outside, the nearer to the good or ultimate reality he comes. Let us examine this more closely. Apparently, Plato is trying to denote the effect the move from the cave to the outside world would have. This division between the worlds is similar to the divided line, that is, the world of the visible and the world of the intelligible forms. The prisoners, therefore, are, cognitively speaking, a few steps away from reality, although they are unaware of it. 515c. The prisoners see only shadows, cast by objects such as people and animals. 514b. 515. The turning around, which is contrary to the usual behavior, of gazing at the wall of shadows, is analogous to the dialectic method, which corresponds to the cognitive level identified as dhyana, mathematical thinking or understanding. Or to use another metaphor, we might say that the dialectic allows us to hoist ourselves into the air with help of scaffolding, and then throw the scaffolding away. Rise 80. Once released from their bonds, however, and able to turn around towards the light, Plato tells us, they would be blinded, and disorientated, not able to see the objects that were the source of the shadows. 515c. If they were to go outside the cave into the sunlight, they would be dazzled by the light even more. 515e. 516. Gradually, however, their eyes would adjust to the light and they would begin to see object themselves. 516a. At first he'd see shadows most easily, then images of men and other things in water, then the things themselves. Finally he'd be able to see the sun, not images of it in water or some alien place. 516b. Why is the move from the cave to outside the cave expressed as disorientation? Why is the prisoner dazzled by the light? Why does Plato take the time to mention this fact? That it entails a shift in perception is clear. However, more than that, it is a new paradigm of perception or new way of being, which will naturally create some discomfort or disorientation. The natural inclination, it seems, in reading the cave is to liken the experience to filling a container with knowledge or instruction. After all, Plato's point is to demonstrate our natural predisposition toward ignorance, and thus reorient us in terms of a proper education. However, our natural inclination would not take us to Plato's meaning. His idea is more like altering the very chemistry of the container. In other words, it is not what is in the container that is being changed but the container itself. How is this done? In effect, this change in being is analogous to a subject-to-object merging. To illustrate this point, some calibrating will be necessary between the notion of self and cognitive levels of image, opinion, understanding and knowledge. It may be useful to keep in mind the eye analogy mentioned earlier, as one considers the divided line and cave. It is important to apply or direct the cognitive levels inward. In other words, instead of looking at the cognitive levels from a distance or purely from an intellectual perspective, consider yourself as the object of inquiry as you travel up various stages. See the chart below. Notice how the various cognitive stages of self correspond to Plato's levels. They each correspond to both the epistemology state of being of the soul and his ontology, objects of knowledge. However, first let us inquire into the nature of self, as this will help us understand the chart better. Divided line cave state of being, objects of knowledge. Self forms dialectic first principle subject to object merging intelligible mathematical thought images square or triangle self reflecting on itself visible belief sensible objects or manufactured belief about self opinion images and shadow self image. What is self? There are various notions of self. Some scholars regard it as the ego, which is meant to encompass an image of oneself that is gender, race, profession, status in society, body and so on. However, others such as Bradley describes it as a habitual disposition, where contents do not changes from day to day or from hour to hour. Bradley 67. Some see the self, as Zahavi points out, as the ability to think I thoughts, which presupposes a first-person concept. It also entails a linguistic ability to use first-person pronoun to refer to oneself, as Zahavi 14. In other words, one becomes an object to oneself by virtue of the relations one has with external conditions, places, people, or family, and so on. Other schools of thought see the origins of self occurring when a baby first recognizes itself in a mirror around 18 months. Lacan 146. However, there is an even more current idea about self, namely, in the area of phenomenology, in which self is found within the framework of its worldly connections. Martin 236. In other words, self doesn't necessarily exist unless one is conscious of something. For instance, when walking into a room, consciousness does not necessarily occur until one observes something attentively like a desk or chair, otherwise the consciousness is free of content. In other words, the mere existence or presence of the desk or chair reveals consciousness insofar as they are being observed by consciousness. The ego or I only emerges, in this view, through the self-directed observation of an object or the objectifying look of another person. These then force one's own reflection to turn upon itself. Martin 237. Excluding the moments when the mind is free of content, consciousness can clearly be taken as the mind directing its intentional aim upon its own states and operations in Havi 14. This echoes Plato's tripartite theory of soul, not only in Book 4 where the rational part controls the other two components, the appetitive and spirited part, but also evident in the Phaedrus dialogue, when the soul is likened to a charioteer in charge of a pair of horses 439d 442d. To begin with, our driver is in charge of a pair of horses, one is beautiful and good and the other its opposite, bad 246b. The charioteer presupposes a self-directing agent, which is clearly what all notions of self more or less imply. However, there is some debate with regard to Plato's notion of the tripartite soul. The tripartite soul, for Grube, a renowned classicist, is inconsistent. In Phaedrus, Grube says, the soul is unitary, then in the Symposium it becomes nothing, still later, in the Republic, it is tripartite. Grube 112. Plato acknowledges his vacillations, by suggesting that we must not study it as it is, while it is maimed by its association with body and other evils, but as it is in its pure state. That is how we should study the soul 611 BD. Thus, it is apparent that Plato sees the soul detached from the body as the pure self. Although we can conclude from this that the self is a self-directing entity, whether or not it is called a soul or tripartite self, some clarification will be needed to point out important distinctions between the self and the soul. The soul in association with the body at the level of images is the self with a small s. The self in its pure state without association with the body at the intelligible level is self with a capital S. The self with a capital S is Plato's soul. Therefore, the self, as we shall see, will go through the following transformation, if we abide by Plato's cognitive progression, and accept his premise, that what is seen at the level of forms is imageless and immutable. Let us begin. The self perceived at the level of images, is an image, or a shadow. Why? Because the very concept of self creates a shadow effect. When the self looks at things posterior to itself, it sees only shadows and images. Moreover, before we can look at the self, we must have had a concept of self beforehand. This also suggests a posterior concept. Posterior concepts are informed by learned ideas, past memories and experiences. These learned ideas and past experience, it should be noted, include not only what is learned through education and experience but language itself. This colors, so to speak, our reality as one projects the remembered past onto the present. The projecting presupposes something that is doing the projecting. In effect, this is the self-directing agent referred to as the self. This gives rise to the division of the subject and object relationship. In other words, the projection is the object and the projector the self. In essence, this dictates and colors the relationship one has with reality. Or, to put it another way, reality is seen not as it is, but in terms of projections, shadows one casts onto it. It should be apparent to the reader that knowledge of reality at this point is uncertain. At the level of belief and opinion, it can be argued, the self is yet another self-concept about its physical nature, and believes in its existence by virtue of the senses. Once again, this creates a shadow effect as well. Belief about its nature is posterior to itself. Third, at the level of understanding, the self begins to turn its gaze upon itself. Indeed, the self can go no further than beholding itself. This is an important step, as self begins to employ the mind's eye rather than images. Call to mind the eye analogy, when the eye turns its gaze away from the mirror. This occurs when posterior ideas about self such as, I'm such and such, or even identification with I, begin to diminish. The final step subject to object merging occurs, when the self penetrates more deeply into the knowledge of itself, and finds its pure self or being. Recall briefly, what Plato sees as the end result of such a step. The soul will be able to grasp the essence of things forms, not only in the abstract but directly as themselves 402b, 520c. As I mentioned before, such a person's view it follows logically will be unified. In other words, they will see things whole. To better illustrate the point, recall also Plotinus' passage regarding the seer and the seen. We ought not even to say that he will see, but that he will be that which he sees, if indeed it is possible any longer, to distinguish seer and seen. Armstrong 136. As the passage suggests, the merging makes it impossible to distinguish between the seer subject and the seen object. In practical terms, this entails asking questions such as, what is the nature of self? Who or what is thinking? What is the source of thought? This line of questioning will impel the thinker to transcend sense perception, like asking questions, such as, what is bigness or smallness, and merge directly with self. In essence, it is Plato's dialectic method applied inwardly. This experience of merging with self aligns with descriptions of mystical experiences, which as we have seen, involve a turn inward and a subject-to-object merging. When one makes no use of images but things themselves forms through the mind's eye, there is no room for self-image. A self-image presupposes a duality. To make the point clearer, the ascension of the soul up the cognitive levels until it terminates in its own being can be portrayed as a pyramid. See diagram below. The apex, which is a unity, becomes the point at which all things are drawn into oneness. Flows downward diverge from the unity and become synonymous with multiplicity and diversity, hence, belief and opinion. A closer examination of the pyramid reveals that wholeness is the common denominator, from which all diverging fragments partake. Its apex consists of first causes or first principles, toward which Plato always seems to gravitate. It follows that anything that travels up the pyramid will arrive at a unity and anything flowing downward will break up into diversity. Recall that in order for the tripartite soul to achieve harmony it must bring the other components into one accord with the rational. This is not only evidence of a drawing into a oneness, but also a substantiation of a downward journey into fragmentation of the soul, if we consider the consequence of a tripartite soul not into one accord. The self, therefore, at the apex level of forms abides in wholeness and is immutable. Thus, the subject-to-object relationship is annihilated. Moreover, a closer examination of the intervals of the pyramid reveal that what is similar can be known by other related things. In other words, the sensible can be discerned by the senses, the object of opinion by opinion, the intelligible by the mind's eye, and unity can only be known when one has achieved unity itself. This, incidentally, adds more credence to the belief that Plato is a mystic. He could not have achieved the heights in thinking that he did, unless he had been to the summit. Diagram. Good knowledge forms subject to object merging understanding intelligible soul self W big S belief self W small s images visible self W small s. To recapitulate, I have pointed out some of the central themes of the Republic, that is, the nature of justice and the philosopher, the building of the city, as analog to the tripartite soul and its harmonizing. In the divided line analogy and the allegory of the cave books Vi and 7 Plato seems to be laying down the framework for ontological knowledge theory, of being dealing with questions concerning being, or what actually exists in epistemological knowledge theory of knowledge relating to, what we can know apart from opinion or conjecture. In essence, Plato appears to devalue the lower forms of knowledge believing that only the higher forms reflect ultimate reality or truth. To perceive ultimate reality, however, sense perception must be discarded and the mind's eye employed. He also makes the distinction between enlightened thinkers versus unenlightened thinkers. To become enlightened means the soul becomes free from bondage, and makes its way out of the cave of darkness and ignorance into the light of true knowledge, which is a unity, or the unified field of self or being. However, to aid in this process, a reorientation through philosophical education is required. This involves Socrates, who tells us, a turning around or redirection of the soul until it is able to study that which is and the brightest thing that is, namely, the one we call the good 518d. This move toward the good was by means of the dialectic method 511 CD. This implies from the standpoint of the educators the enlightened soul a re-entering into the cave. Glaucon expresses his concern for what he perceives as an injustice, if the enlightened philosophers are required to go back into the cave. Then we do them injustice by making them live a worse life, when they could live a better one 519d. Socrates reminds him that it isn't a matter of making one class or individual happy, but making the whole of society happy by bringing them into harmony. Individuals or groups should not go their own way, but do whatever is necessary to bind the city together 520a. The final books of the Republic begin with a rather lengthy discussion regarding types of governments, which like the city are analogues for the inner nature of the soul. Plato narrows them down to 4: aristocracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny. He also orders them from the most ideal to the most decayed and degenerated. In doing so, Plato not only demonstrates an interest in classifying forms of government but also in discovering the process by which one rises out of the other. 78. Plato believes that everything that comes into being must decay 546. Thus, Plato sees the decay of one system into another as different stages in the process. In other words, aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy, oligarchy into democracy, and democracy into tyranny. The process of decay begins, according to Plato, by the intermixing of classes characterized as gold, guardian silver, auxiliary iron and bronze business and laborer class. If they intermix, Plato tells us, it will result in unharmonious equality, which in turn breed war and hostility wherever they arise. Civil war, he goes on to say, is always and everywhere of this lineage 546 of 547. The forms of government, in Plato's view, are reflections of the inner nature of its leaders. The philosopher king is closest to the ideal government, because he is internally disciplined, while the tyrant, whom Plato asserts is driven by insatiable desires and appetites, is furthest from it. In essence, Plato seems to be expounding on this point with regard to the importance of harmonizing or sublimating the appetitive and spirited natures, or else they devolve into tyrannical governments and civil war. These involve, of course, inward tyranny and inward civil wars. In Book 10, Plato revisits his main argument of the Republic, that justice is more beneficial than injustice. However, before doing that he turned back to his concerns regarding literature or poetry, and how they are dangerous if not censored properly. He sees them as imitative, and believes they call attention to sensuous appearances. Order 321. That draw one to the lower rungs of the divided line. According to Socrates, they are makers of images, who know nothing about that which is but only about its appearance. 601b. They neither have right knowledge nor right opinions. 602b. In Plato's view, poets are such a curse on society, he banishes them. 607 BC. Although Plato's discussion of poetry seems a bit out of place, we can conclude he is espousing his concern that poetry is responsible for potentially steering the mind away from reality. Finally, Plato revisits his argument that justice is more beneficial than injustice. He uses the metaphor to convey his argument. According to the story, a warrior who had a life-after-death experience recounts a story in which he came to a place where the souls of the dead were judged and sent to one of two places, upwards into the heavens to be rewarded or downward to be punished. 614 CD. However, before expounding on this point, Socrates thought it was necessary to prove the soul is immortal. According to Plato, this is not as difficult as it sounds. We know that every physical thing has a good and bad element. For instance, some bad elements are sickness for the body, blight for the grain, rot for wood, and rust for iron. 609a. These ultimately result in the disintegration of that thing. Other things may destroy certain things, but they must be appropriate to the thing in question. In other words, if rust left iron unweakened, we would not expect anything else to corrupt it. If disease did not harm the body, we would not believe that any external agency could destroy it. 203. The soul too has its sickness, namely, wickedness. However, wickedness does not appear to destroy the soul. It is common knowledge that some wicked people have long and prosperous lives. This fact, according to Socrates, suggests that the soul is immortal. Moreover, it implies that the soul must be pure. Any trace of variety or difference in substance in it suggests it is not eternal. 203. Later, Socrates demonstrates how just souls reap more rewards than the horrors suffered by really unjust persons in the life after this one. Rice 117. According to the metaphor, the souls are brought together, and made to choose their next life, from which can be either an animal or human. However, the life they choose will establish whether they are rewarded or punished in the next life. Those who lack philosophical virtues or the ability to reason properly and just are those who made poor choices. They vacillated between happiness and unhappiness with every lifetime, whereas the just choose better lives or forms of life that result in a good life. Thus, he validates his point that justice is more beneficial than injustice. In conclusion, Plato uses the most rigorous logic, stories, and analogies in an effort to show what appears to be a mystical vision. Indeed, this is affirmed if we consider his aim of turning the cave dweller towards the light. In essence, as we have seen, this is a turning inward or the self reflecting on itself, which ultimately leads to a subject-to-object merging. It is through the cognitive progression, however, from image to belief, understanding and knowledge that enlightenment is achieved. This, we have seen, corresponds to mystical experiences. Why is this occurring? If we follow Plato's procession of knowledge, it follows logically that this must occur. The true nature of self at the lower levels of the hierarchy cannot be perceived, unless directly perceived at the level of forms where images dissolve. If we examine the dialogues closely, I believe clues can be found that point to the mystical experience. I propose that the merging into one with regard to the tripartite soul, with each component becoming aligned with the rational, which is really a way of purifying us from the defilements of the passions, as well as Socrates' refutation of opinions or belief, to find universals, are both evidence of a synoptic perspective characteristic of mystics, who have achieved a mystical experience. Taylor 3. Recall that the mystical experience entails a sense of unity. This supports the notion that Plato is at the apex of the pyramid or level of forms, which it can be argued account for his inclination to draw everything into oneness. Plato's repugnance toward images as seen in his criticism of poets also supports this. Because of a sense of unity, he is able to refute beliefs, ideas that come and go based upon observation of the sensible world with apparent certainty. Therefore, the opinions or estimates about the nature of justice held by his interlocutors appear rooted in equasia images or positivist belief. Hence, they are nearly always wrong. For instance, if we consider the arguments made with regard to justice, they seem based in what was either popular opinion, or what was in the best interest of the individual with an eye toward the consequences. Consider Thrasymachus' idea that justice is nothing else than the interest of the stronger, Pulmarchus' idea that it is to help friends and harm enemies, or Glaucon's notion that justice is done for its rewards, not for its own sake. In other words, the motives were for self-satisfaction. But for the enlightened person, who has reached the summit of cognitive perception, and has attained annihilation of self, where the ground of self-satisfaction is removed, he alone has found true knowledge and wholeness, where all multiplicity, opinion or image dissolve. Thus, he becomes the master of absolute certainty in regard to all goods. and all his judgments are precise and sure, because they all deduced from this supreme principle. 113. It's clear that Plato's endeavor to bring the soul nearer to the truth aligns well with the mystical experiences we have surveyed. Where mystics use paradoxical descriptions using words such as ineffable and oneness, Plato attempts to explain enlightenment through painstaking logic. Although difficult to prove, I think that there is clear evidence that Plato can be considered a mystic. However, to see the truth of this, one may have to make their own journey to the summit,